Lawmakers, you're about to vote on a budget amendment that will give massive spending authority to the Pentagon so that they can buy weapons from their associates in the defense industry. After you see this information, no one should have to urge you to vote no. Here's an article that appeared in Defense News on Monday, October 17th. Lawmakers seek emergency powers for Pentagon's Ukraine war contracting. Bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate would grant the Pentagon wartime procurement powers, allowing it to buy massive amounts of high-priority munitions using multi-year contracts to help Ukraine fight Russia and to refill U.S. stockpiles. The Senate Armed Services Committee proposed the legislation, which the Senate is expected to vote on in November. The amendment, the text of which was released last week, offers multi-year contracting authorities typically reserved for Navy vessels and major aircraft. As drafted, it would let the Pentagon lock in purchases of certain munitions made by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, etc. over fiscal 23-24, a step aimed at encouraging manufacturers to expand production lines for sought-after munitions. The Pentagon would also be permitted to team with NATO to buy weapons for its members in mass quantities and for Ukraine-related contracts. The legislation would ease several key legal restrictions on Pentagon procurement through fiscal 2024. A sign lawmakers see the war dragging on. Now let's stop here for a minute. A little over a year ago, the European Court of Auditors on 23 September 2021 issued a report. EU support for reforms in Ukraine ineffective in fighting grand corruption. For more than 20 years, the EU has been supporting Ukraine in its reform agenda. Tackling corruption, which is a major obstacle to the country's development and runs counter to EU values, is an integral part of that. Grand corruption and state capture are endemic in Ukraine, as well as hindering competition and growth. They also harm the democratic process. Tens of billions of euros are lost annually as a result of corruption. The EU, European Commission, the European External Action Service, and the EU Advisory Mission have attempted to address this issue and have backed several reforms to reinforce the rule of law and to fight corruption in Ukraine. Despite varied support the EU has offered to Ukraine, oligarchs and vested interests continue to undermine the rule of law in Ukraine and to threaten the country's development, said John Parts, the member of the European Courts of Auditors responsible for the report. Ukraine needs a focused and efficient strategy to tackle the power of oligarchs and diminish state capture. The EU can play a much more significant role than it has done so far. Now, let's look at the word state capture here, and we're going to see what that refers to. On February 22nd, 2019, The Nation published an article, "Neo-Nazis and the Far Right are on the march in Ukraine." 5 years after the Maidan uprising, anti-Semitism and fascist-inflected ultranationalism are rampant. 5 years ago, Ukraine's Maidan uprising ousted President Viktor Yanukovych to the cheers and support of the West. Politicians and analysts in the United States and Europe not only celebrated the uprising as a triumph of democracy, but denied reports of Maidan's ultranationalism, smearing those who warned about the dark side of the uprising as Moscow puppets and useful idiots. Freedom was on the march in Ukraine. Today, increasing reports of far-right violence, ultranationalism, and erosion of basic freedoms are giving the lie to the West's initial euphoria. There are neo-Nazi pogroms against the Roma, rampant attacks on feminists and LGBT groups, book bans, and state-sponsored glorification of Nazi collaborators. These stories of Ukraine's dark nationalism aren't coming out of Moscow. They're being filed by Western media, including U.S.-funded Radio Free Europe, Jewish organizations such as the World Jewish Congress and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and watchdogs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Freedom House, which issued the joint report warning that Kiev is losing monopoly on the use of force in the country as far-right gangs operate with impunity. 5 years after Maidan, the beacon of democracy is looking more like a torchlight march. Now that's enough for me here. Now, are we funding Nazis in Ukraine? Let's take a look a little further back in history with the CIA involvement in Ukraine. Here's an article from the Institute of Policy Studies. Now, this was published in 2001 and has not been updated, but I think you're going to see some connections here. Honest and idealist, enjoys good food and wine, unprejudiced mind. That's how a 1952 Central Intelligence Agency assessment described Nazi ideologue Emil Augsburg, an officer in the infamous Wannsee Institute, the SS think tank involved in planning the final solution. Augsburg's SS unit performed, quote, special duties, a euphemism for exterminating Jews and other undesirables during the Second World War. Although he was wanted in Poland for war crimes, Augsburg managed to integrate himself with the US CIA, which employed him in the late 1940s as an expert on Soviet affairs. Recently released CIA records indicate that Augsburg was among a rogues gallery of Nazi war criminals recruited by US intelligence agencies shortly after Germany surrendered to the Allies. Pried loose by Congress, which passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act 3 years ago, a long-hidden trove of once classified CIA documents confirms one of the worst-kept secrets of the Cold War, the CIA's use of extensive Nazi spy networks to wage a clandestine campaign against the Soviet Union. And we're going to take a look at one of those documents next. This is one of the top secret documents referenced in the previous article. It was called Project Aerodynamic. This is 28 August 1953. The purpose of Project Aerodynamic is to exploit the anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance groups in Western Europe for intelligence purposes. The specific objective of the training and dispatch of agents into the Soviet Union to procure operational documents and positive intelligence and to establish a sound working relationship both in and outside the target area through the whatever they are. Now, if you look down a little further in the document here, the purpose of Project Aerodynamic is to provide for the exploitation and expansion of anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance movement for Cold War and Hot War purposes. So this was back in 1952. It looks like what's been going on has been simmering for several decades. I don't know why our lawmakers don't have access to this or knowledge to this before they vote on such important and world-changing policies. I've just taken you on a trip back through time that exposes the history of Ukraine as a corrupt, Nazi-infested regime. We're now at the point of openly discussing the use of nuclear weapons. I've seen what conventional weapons can do, and I don't understand why any sane person would even think of using nukes. We're provoking Russia by putting nuclear weapons on their border, yet we accuse Putin of being the nuclear threat. Knowingly pushing this propaganda on your constituents is disgusting. Have you done any research on the policies you're promoting? Are you taking the threat of nuclear annihilation seriously? The big question is, What's the goal of this conflict? What's the reason for this loss of life and this dislocation and suffering that's caused to the people over there, and the billions of dollars that we're wasting on this destruction? What's the goal? Well, here's an article that was published in Consortium News in March 2022, right after the invasion. And the cause of the war is certainly much different than what we're being told. Now, if you're a part of spreading this propaganda, that's shameful. If you or your staffer are unaware of this information, that's negligent, and whoever was responsible should be fired. Or if it was you, you should resign. On March 7th, 2022, Consortium News published an article, a study by the Los Alamos Study Group, which is one of the most respected and best informed anti-nuclear war groups in the world, according to John Pilger. Let's see what they had to say. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, what was a regional conflict has become a global hybrid war with ever greater stakes, not least the risk of nuclear war. This is a fact that we are right now on the verge of a nuclear war. Perhaps the greatest danger lies in the difference of motives between parties, which is also the fundamental cause of this war. Russia seeks security, while the United States and its NATO allies have been using Ukraine to deny that security, to break Russia, in Henry Kissinger's 2015 phrase. The United States does not want peace unless it be the peace of a conquered Russia. That is why there is no obvious end to the escalations and counter-escalations. The United States and NATO see opportunity in the war they have been trying so hard to provoke. The tragedy is that few people seem to understand that the root of the Ukraine crisis is a specific strategy known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, named after Paul Wolfowitz, who, as Undersecretary of Defense in the administration of George H.W. Bush, was one of the authors of a 1992 document that laid out a neoconservative manifesto aimed at ensuring American dominance of world affairs following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Our first objective, stated the document, is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival to the United States, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere. This is a dominant consideration underlying a regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. So I'm not sure, is this a war for democracy or is this a war for resources? This is a question for my lawmakers. Another question for my lawmakers. Did you know about the Wolfowitz Doctrine before you started giving all this money and support to Ukraine? Continue. In 2014, Washington engineered a coup in Ukraine that removed the elected leader who sought to reinforce his country's relationship with neighboring Russia. It was a product of the 1992 doctrine and the extremism it represented. Victoria Nuland, a neoconservative ideologue and President Barack Obama's point person in Ukraine, has played the same role in President Joe Biden's State Department. 1992 doctrine is elaborated in an infamous RAND study on how to overextend and, in Kissinger's words, break Russia. This is U.S. foreign policy today, a fact well understood by Russian leadership who regard their country as effectively under siege by the United States. The potential of American missiles pointed at Moscow from former Soviet satellite countries, together with NATO troop deployments, is the reality they see. A militarized and virulently anti-Russian Ukraine being used as a tool by the United States with an expressed wish for nuclear weapons on the brink of invading Russian sympathizing provinces on the Russian border. All that was too much for Russia. What do you suppose the U.S. would do if such a situation arose in Mexico or Canada? Now, here's some of the study group's basic conclusions. Understanding why Russia invaded is not condoning the invasion. Russia's view is that of existential dangers to its very existence. The sincerity of that view is evident in the grave risk Russia is taking in this invasion, which, again, we need neither justify nor condemn. Russia's view has to be respected, whether or not we agree with it. Failure by the United States and NATO over the course of decades to respect Russia's position and to provide a humane and reasonable provision for Russian security needs is the main, if not the only material cause of the present conflict. Again, lawmakers, were you aware of this? Some 13,000 people have died during the 8 years since the 2014 coup, according to the United Nations. The Ukrainian government has overtly genocidal policies toward Russian minorities. Since 2014 U.S.-sponsored coup, the U.S. and its European allies have used Ukraine to undermine Russian security. Nazi and neo-Nazi formations and ideologies in Ukraine present a clear danger to human rights and human life everywhere. The question here, lawmakers, were you aware of any of this? And if so, what was the reason for ignoring it in your decision to fund an obviously corrupt, Nazi-infested country?